Approximately 66 million years ago, the conditions that had sustained complex life on Earth for over 180 million years collapsed within a geological instant. What followed was not a gradual decline, not a slow erosion of ecosystems worn down by incremental pressures, but a systemic failure of planetary scale, one that would permanently restructure the biosphere and alter the trajectory of life on Earth in ways that persist to the present day. To understand the scale of what occurred, it is necessary to first understand what the term mass extinction means in precise scientific terms. A mass extinction is defined as a period during which the planet loses more than 75% of its species within a geologically short interval, typically measured in tens of thousands to a few million years. Earth has experienced 5 such events in its documented history. The event, 66 million years ago, known formally as the Cretaceous-Paleogene Extinction Event, or the KPG boundary, represents the most recent of these. It does not, however, represent the largest in terms of raw species loss. That distinction belongs to the Permian-Triassic extinction event approximately 252 million years ago, during which an estimated 90 to 96% of all marine species and roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species were eliminated. What makes the KPG event singular is not its total magnitude, but the nature of its cause, the speed of its onset, and the specificity of what it destroyed. Before we continue, take a moment to consider where you're watching, from which country, and how far removed it is from the hours after the impact, when the extinction wasn't instant but unfolding in slow, devastating stages. If you find yourself drawn into this, consider subscribing and supporting the channel as we continue. It's always striking to see how far these stories reach. Dim the lights, take a steady breath, and let the present dissolve into a sky thick with ash as embers drift through broken forests and the faint, uneasy rustle of a world carries on. Not yet gone, but no longer the same. The Permian-Triassic extinction unfolded over a period now estimated at between 60,000 and several 100,000 years. Driven primarily by prolonged volcanic activity in what is now Siberia, a flood basalt province known as the Siberian Traps, which released massive quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other compounds into the atmosphere over an extended period. The KPG event operated on a fundamentally different timescale. Its initiating mechanism, the impact of an asteroid approximately 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter, delivered its energy in a matter of seconds. The bolide struck the shallow carbonate platform of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in southeastern Mexico, at a location that would later be identified as the Chicxulub impact structure. The crater that resulted measures roughly 180 kilometers in diameter and extends to depths of approximately 20 kilometers into the crust. The energy released has been estimated at roughly 10 billion times, the yield of the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima in 1945, equivalent to approximately 100 teratons of TNT. That energy did not simply destroy what was immediately beneath and around the impact site. It set in motion a cascade of environmental disruptions that would operate across multiple timescales simultaneously, from the immediate and local to the global and prolonged each phase, creating conditions that were incompatible with the survival requirements of a large portion of Earth's species. The KPG extinction is estimated to have eliminated approximately 75 to 80% of all species on Earth. Among those species were all non-avian dinosaurs, a group that had been the dominant large-bodied terrestrial vertebrates for approximately 165 million years. Their disappearance was not a foregone conclusion embedded in the nature of the impact alone. It was the product of specific biological vulnerabilities intersecting with specific environmental outcomes. Understanding that intersection requires examining each phase of the post-impact environment with precision, beginning with the state of the world immediately before the asteroid arrived. But before moving to those conditions, it is worth anchoring the temporal scale of what the KPG event represents within the broader context of Earth's history. The planet is approximately 4.54 billion years old. Complex, multicellular animal life, the kind capable of leaving substantive fossil records, has existed for roughly 540 million years, a period known as the Phanerozoic Eon. Within that time frame, the 5 major mass extinction events represent moments of punctuation intervals during which the accumulated diversity of life was sharply and irreversibly reduced. Each was followed by a period of recovery, during which surviving lineages diversified to fill ecological roles left vacant by the extinct. These recovery periods are measured not in thousands, but in millions of years. Following the KPG event, current evidence suggests that global ecosystems required approximately 10 million years to return to levels of biodiversity comparable to those present before the impact. That figure alone communicates the magnitude of what the KPG event represents. 10 million years is not an abstraction. It is a duration longer than the entire span of recognizable human evolution. The world that existed before the asteroid and the world that existed after it are, in biological terms, 2 fundamentally different planets separated by a boundary so sharp that it can be identified in the geological record as a distinct layer of sediment enriched in iridium, a metal rare in Earth's crust but abundant in certain classes of asteroids. This iridium-rich layer, deposited globally within a short period following the impact, was one of the critical lines of evidence that led physicist Luis Alvarez and geologist Walter Alvarez, along with colleagues Frank Casaro and Helen Michel, to propose in 1980 that a large asteroid impact had caused the KPG extinction. That hypothesis, initially contested, has since been supported by a convergence of evidence spanning geochemistry, physics, paleontology, and planetary science. The iridium layer is not the only marker. The KPG boundary in the sedimentary record is also characterized by the presence of shocked quartz grains of the mineral that bear distinctive planar deformation features produced only under pressures exceeding those achievable by volcanic activity consistent with hypervelocity impact. It contains spherules of glass and rock formed from material that was vaporized or melted by the impact and then solidified during atmospheric re-entry. It is associated globally with a sharp and nearly simultaneous disappearance of the fossil signatures of species that had been present in abundance immediately below it. The boundary is not gradual, it is a line. What that line represents, at its most fundamental level, is a threshold. On one side of it, a world that had been operating under a relatively stable set of environmental parameters for tens of millions of years. On the other side, a world in which those parameters had been disrupted across virtually every dimension that matters to living organisms: temperature, light availability, atmospheric chemistry, food supply, ocean acidity. The organisms that survived the transition did so not because they were superior in any abstract sense, but because their specific biological characteristics happened to be compatible with the conditions that followed. Those that did not survive, including the non-avian dinosaurs, lacked, or were unable to deploy, whatever combination of traits would have been necessary to endure what came next. What came next began 66 million years ago, in the late Cretaceous period, on a planet that was, by any measure, thriving. The late Cretaceous period, in the final millions of years before the impact, was a world of considerable biological richness and environmental stability. Global temperatures were, on average, warmer than those of the present-day estimate derived from oxygen isotope. Analysis of marine sediments suggests that mean surface temperatures were approximately 4 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than current global peer averages. The polar regions, while cooler than the tropics, were largely free of permanent ice sheets. Sea levels were higher, driven in part by the absence of large polar ice caps and in part by elevated rates of seafloor spreading, which displaced ocean water upward onto continental margins. Shallow inland seas covered portions of what are now the interior plains of North America, Europe, and Asia. The atmosphere contained elevated concentrations of carbon dioxide relative to pre-industrial levels, sustaining a greenhouse effect that maintained warmth across latitudes that today would be considerably colder. These conditions had persisted, with fluctuations, for tens of millions of years. They had shaped the biology, distribution, and behavior of every organism alive at the time. The ecosystems of the late Cretaceous were not fragile assemblages on the edge of collapse. They were mature, complex, and deeply interconnected, the product of evolutionary processes operating continuously across vast spans of time. The continents themselves occupied positions meaningfully different from those of the present. The supercontinent Pangaea had broken apart hundreds of millions of years earlier, and by the late Cretaceous, the landmasses had drifted into configurations broadly recognizable as precursors to their modern forms, though with significant differences. North America and Europe were not yet fully separated. India was an isolated subcontinent moving northward across what would become the Indian Ocean. Antarctica was positioned closer to the equator than it is today and supported vegetation. These geographic configurations influenced ocean circulation, climate patterns, and the distribution of species, creating a world partitioned into distinct biogeographic zones, each with its own ecological character. Into this world, on a day approximately 66.043 million years ago, as measured by high-precision radiometric dating of impact-related deposits, an asteroid entered Earth's atmosphere at an estimated velocity of between 20 and 30 kilometers per second. The object is classified as a carbonaceous or possibly siliceous chondrite based on the geochemical signature of the impact deposit, though its precise composition remains a subject of ongoing research. Its diameter, estimated from the size of the resulting crater and the volume of ejected material, was approximately 10 to 12 kilometers, roughly the height of Earth's atmosphere from the surface to the stratosphere. It was not a particularly large asteroid by the standards of solar system history, but its size, composition, velocity, and the specific geology of its target combined to produce consequences of exceptional severity. The angle of impact matters. Modeling studies, including three-dimensional simulations based on the geometry of the Chicxulub crater and the distribution of ejecta deposits, suggest that the asteroid struck at an angle of approximately 45 to 60 degrees relative to the surface, an oblique trajectory that maximized the volume of material ejected into the upper atmosphere and directed much of that ejection toward the north and northeast. A steeper or shallower angle of impact would have produced different distributions of energy and ejecta, and potentially different environmental outcomes. The specific geometry of the Chicxulub impact appears, on current evidence, to have been particularly effective at driving the extinction mechanisms that followed. The target geology compounded the severity. The Yucatan platform in the late Cretaceous was composed of thick sequences of carbonate and sulfate rock, limestone, and gypsum overlying the crystalline basement. When the asteroid struck, These rocks were vaporized almost instantaneously. Carbonates, when heated to the extreme temperatures generated by hypervelocity impact, decompose and release carbon dioxide. Sulfates release sulfur dioxide and sulfur trioxide. The volume of these gases, injected into the stratosphere by the Chicxulub impact, has been estimated at between 100 and 500 billion metric tons of sulfur dioxide alone, with additional quantities of carbon dioxide and water vapor. The sulfur compounds would prove to be among the most consequential products of the impact, not immediately, but across the months and years that followed. The world into which the asteroid arrived on that day was occupied, in its terrestrial environments, by a diverse and well-established fauna. Across the landmasses of the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in the region of Laramidia, the western portion of North America, large-bodied ceratopsid dinosaurs moved through forested and open environments. Hadrosaurs, the duck-billed herbivores, were among the most numerically abundant of the large dinosaurs, their populations distributed across broad geographic ranges and diverse habitat types. Tyrannosaurs occupied the apex predator role in the ecosystems of Laramidia. In the southern hemisphere, on the landmasses that would become South America, Africa, and portions of Asia, different faunal assemblages prevailed: large titanosaur sauropods, abelisaurid theropods, and other lineages that had diversified in geographic isolation from their northern counterparts. The oceans were similarly populated with complex communities. Mosasaurs, large marine reptiles reaching lengths of up to 17 meters, occupied open water environments. Plesiosaurs persisted in some regions. The seas supported rich assemblages of ammonites, bivalves, fish, and marine invertebrates. In the air, pterosaurs, some with wingspans exceeding 10 meters, shared the sky with the increasingly diverse avian lineages that had been radiating since the Jurassic. This was the world at the moment of impact. It was not a world under stress in any systemic sense. The ecosystems were functioning, the food chains were intact, the dominant organisms were biologically robust and ecologically successful. The asteroid did not arrive into a weakened or destabilized biosphere. It arrived into a planet operating at a level of ecological complexity and productivity that had taken hundreds of millions of years to assemble. That context is not incidental. It bears directly on the question of what happened next and why the consequences were as severe as they were. A disruption of equivalent physical magnitude striking a less diverse or less interconnected biosphere might have produced different outcomes. The very stability and complexity of late Cretaceous ecosystems meant that the cascade of failures triggered by the impact propagated through food webs and environmental systems with extraordinary efficiency. Each disrupted link destabilized the ones connected to it. At the moment the asteroid made contact with the Yucatan platform, the surface temperature at the point of impact reached tens of thousands of degrees Celsius within microseconds. The rock beneath the impactor did not simply fracture, it underwent a phase transition, moving from solid to liquid to vapor faster than any geological process in Earth's history up to that point. A transient cavity approximately 100 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep formed and then collapsed within minutes, producing the complex crater structure that geophysical surveys would later map in detail. The energy released in those first seconds was sufficient to trigger earthquakes of magnitude 10 or greater across much of the planet, generate tsunamis with initial wave heights estimated in the hundreds of meters in the Gulf of Mexico, and launch a plume of vaporized and molten material into and beyond the upper atmosphere. The day had begun as any other in the late Cretaceous. By the time the first pressure waves had propagated outward from the Yucatan, it would never be that kind of day again. The question of how healthy dinosaur populations were in the final period before the Chicxulub impact is not merely academic. It bears directly on the interpretation of the extinction itself, on whether what occurred 66 million years ago represents a sudden termination of a thriving lineage or the final collapse of a group already in decline. The evidence, examined carefully, supports the former interpretation far more strongly than the latter, though the picture is not without complexity. For much of the 20th century, a persistent hypothesis held that dinosaurs were already in decline before the asteroid arrived. This view was supported primarily by patterns observed in the fossil record of the Hell Creek Formation, a sequence of sedimentary rock in the western interior of North America that preserves the last approximately 1.5 million years of non-avian dinosaur history, with unusual resolution. Early analyses of that record suggested that dinosaur diversity was decreasing in the final million years of the Cretaceous, with fewer genera appearing in successively younger rock layers. If accurate, this would imply that the asteroid delivered a final blow to a lineage already weakened by other pressures, possibly volcanic activity, climate fluctuation, or ecological reorganization. More recent and methodologically rigorous analyses have substantially revised that picture. The apparent decline in diversity observed in earlier studies has been attributed, in large part, to a sampling artifact known as the senior lips effect, a well-documented phenomenon in paleontology whereby species appear to vanish from the fossil record before their actual extinction, simply because fossilization is an incomplete and geologically uneven process. Organisms do not fossilize with equal probability across all environments and time periods. The closer a species' last appearance in the fossil record is to a major boundary event, the more likely it is that its apparent disappearance reflects a gap in preservation rather than a genuine biological decline. When statistical methods are applied to correct for sampling biases, the pattern of dinosaur diversity in the final Cretaceous changes considerably. A 2016 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining the Hell Creek fauna using model-based diversity estimation found no statistically significant evidence for a long-term decline in dinosaur species richness in the 10 million years preceding the impact. A subsequent analysis published in 2022 Inches, the journal Science, using a broader global dataset and Bayesian statistical frameworks, similarly concluded that non-avian dinosaur diversity was not in meaningful decline at the family level in the late Cretaceous. The study noted that while some clades showed regional contractions, others were actively diversifying during the same interval. What the fossil record does show when examined at sufficient resolution is a dinosaur fauna that was ecologically differentiated, broadly distributed, and biologically diverse up to the very end of the Cretaceous. In the Hell Creek ecosystem alone, a single geographic region representing a fraction of the global dinosaur range, paleontologists have identified multiple species of ceratopsids, hadrosaurs, ankylosaurs, pachycephalosaurs, ornithomimosaurs, and tyrannosaurids coexisting within the same depositional environment. These were not remnant populations clinging to marginal habitats. They were the dominant large-bodied vertebrates in a functioning ecosystem, occupying a full range of ecological roles from high-browsing megaherbivory to apex predation. The ceratopsids of the late Cretaceous were among the most successful large herbivores the planet had produced. Triceratops, the most well-documented ceratopsid of the Hell Creek Formation, was an animal of considerable size. Adults reached body masses estimated between 6,000 and 12,000 kilograms and appears to have been extraordinarily abundant. Triceratops fossils constitute a disproportionately large fraction of the large vertebrate remains in Hell Creek deposits, suggesting that the genus was, at the time of the extinction, one of the numerically dominant large animals in its environment. Its functional morphology, a robust beak adapted for cropping tough vegetation, elaborate dental batteries capable of processing fibrous plant material, and a body plan suggesting high food intake requirements indicates an organism fully adapted to and dependent upon the productive plant communities of the late Cretaceous. It was not a species under physiological or ecological stress, it was a species at the height of its ecological integration. Hadrosaurs present a similar picture across a broader geographic range. These animals, which included genera such as Edmontosaurus in North America and various Asian forms, possessed among the most sophisticated herbivore dentitions of any known terrestrial vertebrate dental batteries composed of hundreds of closely packed teeth forming a continuous grinding surface, capable of processing large volumes of abrasive plant material efficiently. Their populations extended across multiple continents. Evidence from bone bed deposit sites where the remains of many individuals of the same species are preserved together suggests that at least some hadrosaur species formed large aggregations, potentially analogous to the herding behavior seen in large modern ungulates. These were not isolated or dwindling populations. They were animals whose biology and behavior reflected adaptation to abundant and reliable food resources. In the southern hemisphere, Titanosaur sauropods, the last surviving members of the sauropod lineage, reached body sizes among the largest ever achieved by terrestrial animals. Species such as Patagotitan maiorum, known from deposits in Argentina, dated to the mid-Cretaceous but representative of a lineage that persisted to the end of the period, are estimated to have reached body masses of 60,000 to 70,000 kilograms or more. Sustaining animals of that size requires ecosystems of exceptional primary productivity. The persistence of titanosaurs through the late Cretaceous is itself evidence that the plant communities of the southern hemisphere were capable of supporting enormous biomass demands. The theropod dinosaurs, the bipedal carnivores and omnivores that included the ancestors of modern birds, were similarly diverse and ecologically varied at the end of the Cretaceous. Tyrannosaurid theropods in North America and Asia represented the apex predators of their respective ecosystems, with Tyrannosaurus rex achieving body masses estimated between 8,000 and 14,000 kilograms and possessing bite forces measured through biomechanical modeling of skull geometry and jaw musculature at values exceeding 35,000 to 57,000 newtons, among the highest estimated for any terrestrial predator in Earth's history. Smaller theropod lineages, Dromaeosaurids, Troodontids, Oviraptorosaurs occupied intermediate ecological roles, filling niches as small predators, omnivores, and egg consumers. The theropod guild, taken as a whole, was ecologically layered in a manner consistent with a mature and stable predator-prey system. Beyond diversity and abundance, there is evidence bearing on the physiological state of dinosaur populations in the terminal Cretaceous. Growth rate studies, conducted by analyzing the internal bone microstructure of dinosaur specimens through a technique known as paleohistology, have consistently shown that large dinosaurs were growing rapidly and reaching reproductive maturity at rates more consistent with elevated metabolic activity than with the slow growth characteristic of ectothermic reptiles. The bone tissue of late Cretaceous dinosaurs shows no systematic evidence of nutritional stress, prolonged growth interruption, or the kinds of pathological changes that might be expected in populations experiencing resource limitation or environmental degradation. The individuals preserved in the fossil record were, for the most part, well-nourished animals growing at rates their biology was capable of sustaining. There is also the question of the contemporaneous volcanic activity that has sometimes been invoked as a contributing stressor, The Deccan Traps, a massive flood basalt province in what is now western India, were actively erupting in the final million years of the Cretaceous, releasing significant volumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere. The climatic effects of Deccan volcanism remain a subject of active research and some debate. Some studies have argued that Deccan-driven climate fluctuations may have placed stress on certain dinosaur populations or ecosystems in the final Cretaceous. Others have found limited evidence for ecosystem-level disruption attributable to Deccan activity in the biological record immediately preceding the KPG boundary. The current weight of evidence does not support the conclusion that Deccan volcanism had driven dinosaur populations to a state of vulnerability sufficient to make the KPG extinction likely in its absence. The picture that emerges from the totality of available evidence is of a dinosaur fauna that was, in the final millions of years of the Cretaceous, ecologically dominant, biologically diverse, and physiologically robust. Individual lineages had experienced the kinds of regional fluctuations and turnovers that are normal features of any long-lived clade operating across changing environments over millions of years. But at the level of the group as a whole, there is no compelling evidence of systemic decline. The non-avian dinosaurs were not a spent lineage waiting for a final blow. They were, by any reasonable biological measure, among the most successful large-bodied animals the planet had ever produced, and they remained so until the moment the conditions of their world were fundamentally and irreversibly altered. The asteroid made contact with the shallow carbonate platform of the Yucatan at a velocity of approximately 20 kilometers per second. At that speed, the kinetic energy of the impactor was so large that the distinction between solid rock and the asteroid itself became, for a brief interval, effectively meaningless. The target rock did not behave as a solid under the pressures generated by the impact. It behaved as a fluid. Within the first second of contact, a volume of rock equivalent to the asteroid's own mass was set in motion, compressed, displaced, and accelerated outward and downward by a pressure wave propagating through the crust at velocities exceeding the speed of sound in rock, approximately 5 to 8 kilometers per second. The temperature at the point of contact reached values in the range of tens of thousands of degrees Celsius almost instantaneously. At those temperatures, rock does not melt in the conventional sense, it vaporizes. The asteroid itself was largely converted to plasma and vapor within the first fraction of a second. The carbonate and sulfate rocks of the Yucatan platform underwent the same transformation across a volume extending several kilometers in every direction from the point of contact. A fireball of vaporized rock and asteroid material expanded outward and upward at hypersonic velocities, punching through the atmosphere and extending into the upper stratosphere and beyond within the first minute of the impact. The transient crater, the initial cavity formed by the displacement of rock before gravitational collapse, reached a diameter of approximately 100 kilometers and a depth of roughly 30 kilometers within the first 2 to 3 minutes. This cavity was not stable. The rock surrounding it, subjected to pressures and temperatures far beyond its structural limits, rebounded. The crater floor rose in a process known as central uplift, pushing a column of rock upward toward the surface that may have briefly exceeded 10 kilometers in height before collapsing outward. The rim of the transient crater simultaneously collapsed inward. Within approximately 10 minutes of the initial contact, the transient cavity had been replaced by the complex, multi-ring structure that would eventually be buried beneath sediment and identified, more than 65 million years later, as the Chicxulub crater. The seismic energy released by this process propagated outward through the crust in all directions. The ground motion generated at the impact site has been estimated through scaling relationships derived from nuclear test data and impact modeling as equivalent to an earthquake of magnitude 10 to 11 on the moment magnitude scale. For context, the largest instrumentally recorded earthquake in human history, the 1960 Valdivia earthquake in Chile, measured magnitude 9.5. The seismic waves from the Chicxulub impact would have reached the opposite side of the planet within approximately 20 minutes, producing ground motion of sufficient intensity to trigger secondary earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic activity along pre-existing fault systems and tectonic boundaries. The Deccan Traps eruptions in India may have been influenced, at least in part, by the seismic energy delivered by the impact, a hypothesis supported by the observation that eruption rates appear to have increased in the period immediately following the KPG boundary. For any organism within several hundred kilometers of the Yucatan at the moment of impact, survival was not a meaningful possibility. The combination of thermal radiation from the fireball, overpressure from the atmospheric blast wave, and violent ground motion would have eliminated life across this zone within the first minutes. But the consequences of the impact were not confined to the immediate vicinity of the crater. They were already propagating outward at the speed of light, the speed of sound, and the speed of seismically driven ground motion, each mechanism operating on a different timescale and affecting organisms in different ways depending on their distance from the impact point. The thermal pulse, electromagnetic radiation, primarily infrared, emitted by the expanding fireball and by the superheated ejector, re-entering the atmosphere, traveled at the speed of light and reached distant regions within minutes. At distances of 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers from the impact site, the thermal radiation would have been sufficient to ignite exposed vegetation and cause severe burns to any animal without immediate shelter. At greater distances, the intensity diminished with the square of distance, but modeling studies suggest that even at ranges of several thousand kilometers, the thermal pulse may have been sufficient to heat exposed surfaces to temperatures capable of causing combustion under dry conditions. The blast wave, the overpressure front generated by the explosive release of energy at the impact site, propagated through the atmosphere at speeds initially exceeding the speed of sound, decelerating as it expanded across the hemisphere. At distances of 1,000 kilometers, overpressures of tens of atmospheres would have been sufficient to destroy vegetation and kill exposed animals through barotrauma and physical displacement. At 5,000 kilometers, overpressures would have diminished substantially but remained capable of felling trees and disrupting surface environments. Meanwhile, the ejector plume was following a trajectory that would have global consequences. Material launched from the impact site at velocities sufficient to escape the lower atmosphere, estimated at several cubic kilometers of rock vapor, melt droplets, and pulverized debris, followed ballistic trajectories that carried it across the globe. As this material re-entered the atmosphere, it was heated by friction to incandescent temperatures, releasing thermal energy back toward the surface in what has been described as a global infrared pulse lasting approximately 1 to 2 hours. The intensity of this pulse, at its peak, has been estimated to be equivalent to several times the energy received from the Sun under normal conditions, sufficient, according to some models, to heat the surface of exposed land to temperatures capable of igniting dry organic material across much of the planet. For the dinosaurs of North America, the geographic region closest to the Chicxulub impact site among the major dinosaur-bearing landmasses, the first minutes represented an experience without biological precedent. The ground itself moved with amplitudes and frequencies inconsistent with any prior seismic event in their evolutionary history. Light levels at the surface would have increased dramatically as the fireball expanded, followed by the arrival of the thermal pulse. Atmospheric pressure fluctuated violently as the blast wave passed. The sensory environment experienced by animals within the affected zone would have been entirely outside anything their nervous systems had been shaped by evolution to process. Animals in burrows, caves, or dense water environments that provided physical shielding from thermal radiation and overpressure had a measurable advantage over those in open environments. This observation is not trivial. It connects directly to one of the patterns most clearly visible in the KPG extinction record: the strong survivorship bias towards small-bodied animals capable of rapid concealment, burrowing, or aquatic refuge. Large-bodied dinosaurs, by virtue of their size alone, had no access to the kinds of physical shelter that would have provided meaningful protection from the immediate effects of the impact. A Triceratops or an Edmontosaurus standing in open habitat in the western interior of North America on the day of the impact had no behavioral or physiological response available to it that could have mitigated the thermal and pressure effects propagating outward from the Yucatan. At distances beyond the immediate zone of lethal effect in Asia, Africa, and the Southern Hemisphere, the first minutes of the post-impact world would have registered as unusual but not immediately catastrophic. Seismic waves would have arrived, producing ground motion ranging from strong to moderate depending on distance and local geology. A brightening of the sky, caused by the expanding fireball visible above the horizon, may have been perceptible, but the full cascade of consequences was still developing. The mechanisms that would ultimately drive the global extinction were not yet fully operational. They were being loaded, accumulating in the atmosphere and in the thermal state of the surface in the minutes immediately following the impact, preparing to unfold across the hours, days, weeks, and months that followed. The first minutes after the Chicxulub impact were, in physical terms, among the most energetic interval in Earth's history since the period of heavy bombardment more than 4 billion years ago. For the organisms that survived them, and many did, at sufficient distance from the impact site, what came next would prove, in the aggregate, far more consequential than the impact itself. N. The hour following the impact, the dominant physical process affecting the global surface environment was thermal. The ejector that had been launched from the Chicxulub site at velocities sufficient to reach the upper atmosphere and beyond was now returning. Across the planet, from distances of thousands of kilometers to the antipodal hemisphere, particles of glass, rock vapor condensate, and pulverized crustal material were re-entering the atmosphere along ballistic trajectories. As each particle decelerated through friction with the upper atmosphere, it released its kinetic energy as heat. Individually, a single particle is inconsequential. Collectively, across the volume of material estimated to have been ejected on the order of tens of thousands of cubic kilometers of rock and vapor, the aggregate thermal energy delivered to the atmosphere during re-entry was enormous. The duration of this re-entry pulse has been modeled at approximately 1 to 2 hours for the peak intensity phase, with a trailing period of lower intensity heating as smaller and slower particles continue to arrive. During peak re-entry, the energy flux reaching the surface from above has been estimated, in some models, at values between 2 and 5 times the normal solar constant, the amount of energy Earth receives from the Sun per unit area under standard conditions, approximately 1,361 watts per square meter. For the surface of the planet, this represented a brief but intense thermal loading from above, arriving simultaneously across most of the hemisphere, facing away from the impact site, and, to a lesser degree, across the hemisphere that had already experienced the direct effects of the fireball. The consequences for terrestrial vegetation were direct and rapid. Dry organic material, dead wood, leaf litter, dry grasses, exposed bark ignites at temperatures generally between 250 and 300 degrees Celsius. The surface heating produced by the re-entry pulse, particularly in regions with dry conditions, was sufficient to reach or exceed these thresholds across extensive areas. The result was the initiation of wildfires on a geographic scale that has no analogue in the observational or historical record of the Holocene. Evidence for these fires is preserved in the geological record in the form of a globally distributed layer of soot elemental carbon produced by the incomplete combustion of organic material found within or immediately above the KPG boundary layer at sites across North America, Europe, and elsewhere. The quantity of soot preserved in these deposits has been estimated through geochemical analysis to represent the combustion of a substantial fraction of the above-ground biomass present on the planet at the time of the impact. The distribution of fire was not uniform. It was shaped by the moisture content of vegetation, the prevailing atmospheric conditions at the time of the impact, the intensity of the thermal pulse at different latitudes and longitudes, and the physical structure of different ecosystem types. Regions with dry conditions and high fuel loads, open woodlands, seasonally dry forests, grassland margins were most vulnerable to ignition. Regions with high moisture content, tropical rainforests, wetlands, riparian corridors were more resistant, though not immune. Coastal and aquatic environments provided partial buffering against the thermal pulse for organisms capable of immersion. For the dinosaur faunas of different regions, the first hours produced sharply differentiated outcomes depending on the ecosystem type they inhabited. In the forested environments of late Cretaceous North America, the river floodplains, coastal plain forests, and upland woodlands of Laramidia fire propagated rapidly through accumulated fuel loads. The dominant large herbivores of these environments, including hadrosaurs and ceratopsids, had no behavioral capacity to outrun fire fronts moving through dry forest. Large-bodied animals generate heat internally and dissipate it slowly, a consequence of the relationship between body volume and surface area that scales unfavorably with increasing size. Under conditions of extreme ambient heating, large animals face a physiological disadvantage relative to small ones. Their thermal inertia, the resistance of their body temperature to rapid change, works against them when the environment is delivering heat rather than absorbing it. A large hadrosaur standing in open habitat during the re-entry pulse would have been exposed to radiant heating from above with limited capacity for behavioral thermoregulation. The forested dinosaur habitats of Asia present a somewhat different picture. At the distances involved, approximately 15,000 to 18,000 kilometers from the Chicxulub impact site, the re-entry pulse would have been less intense than in North America, though still significant. Asian dinosaur faunas, including the diverse assemblages of ceratopsids, hadrosaurs, and theropods known from the Nemegt Formation and equivalent deposits, would have experienced the seismic effects, the thermal pulse, and the onset of wildfire, but with somewhat reduced initial intensity compared to the North American record. The coastal and shallow marine environments of the late Cretaceous experienced the first hours differently from terrestrial habitats. The tsunamis generated by the Chicxulub impact waves, with initial amplitudes estimated at hundreds of meters in the Gulf of Mexico, diminishing with distance but remaining substantial across the Atlantic and into the Pacific, propagated outward from the impact site at velocities determined by ocean depth, typically between 500 and 800 kilometers per hour in deep water. Within the first few hours, these waves had reached the coastlines of North America, Central America, and the northern margins of South America, inundating low-lying coastal environments to depths and distances determined by local bathymetry and coastal topography. Any dinosaur fauna occupying low-elevation coastal habitats in the Gulf region would have encountered tsunami inundation within 1 to 3 hours of the impact. The atmospheric effects of the first hours extended beyond thermal loading. The fireball and the re-entry heating had deposited enormous quantities of energy into the upper atmosphere, driving powerful convective cells and disrupting normal atmospheric circulation patterns. Winds of exceptional velocity were generated at multiple scales locally by the pressure differentials created by the fireball and blast wave, regionally by the thermal gradients produced by differential heating of the surface, and globally as the redistribution of energy through the atmosphere began to reorganize circulation patterns that had been stable for millions of years. The transport of smoke, soot, and fine particulate material from the fires into the upper atmosphere began within hours of ignition, initiating a process that would have consequences extending far beyond the first day. For carnivorous dinosaurs, the theropods that occupied apex and mesopredator roles across the late Cretaceous ecosystems, the first hours presented an immediate crisis distinct from that faced by herbivores. Large theropods, such as Tyrannosaurus and its relatives, were dependent on a continuous supply of large prey animals. Their energetic requirements, inferred from body mass estimates and metabolic scaling relationships, were substantial. A large tyrannosaurid required the consumption of hundreds of kilograms of meat at irregular intervals to maintain metabolic function. Under normal conditions, the prey base, large hadrosaurs and ceratopsids, was abundant and accessible. Within the first hours of the post-impact world, that prey base was being disrupted. Animals were dying from thermal effects, fire, and physical trauma. Others were moving erratically in response to sensory disruption. The behavioral coherence of prey herds the organized movement patterns that large predators exploit was breaking down. Smaller theropods and non-dinosaurian vertebrates faced a different set of immediate challenges. Animals below approximately 25 kilograms in body mass had access to a wider range of refugia burrows, dense vegetation, water bodies, rocky substrates that provided partial shielding from thermal radiation. The survivorship of small vertebrates through the KPG boundary, relative to large ones, is one of the most consistent patterns in the extinction record and is consistent with the physics of the first hours. Small body size conferred access to physical shelter unavailable to large animals, and reduced thermal mass meant reduced heat absorption from the radiant environment. By the end of the first hours, approximately 3 to 6 hours after impact, the surface of the planet had been fundamentally altered across much of the northern hemisphere and significant portions of the southern. Fires were burning across multiple continents. Tsunamis had restructured coastal environments across the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic margins. The atmosphere above the impact hemisphere was laden with smoke, soot, and particulate material rising into the stratosphere on convective columns driven by the heat of combustion below. The seismic aftershocks from the impact continued to propagate through the crust. The ocean chemistry in the Gulf of Mexico and adjacent regions was being altered by the influx of impact debris, fresh water from inland drainage disruption, and the physical mixing driven by the tsunami waves. The dinosaurs that remained alive at this point, and many did, particularly those at sufficient distance from the impact site and in habitats that had provided some degree of thermal shielding, were now entering a world whose physical parameters were shifting in ways that would not stabilize for months or years. The immediate violence of the first hours was giving way to a slower, more pervasive, and ultimately more lethal set of processes. The fires that had ignited across the continents were feeding material into the atmosphere that would, over the days and weeks ahead, alter the one resource no terrestrial organism could survive without: sunlight. Within the first 24 to 72 hours following the Chicxulub impact, the most immediate and locally violent effects had largely run their course. The fireball had dissipated. The re-entry pulse had ended. The blast wave had circumnavigated the globe and attenuated to levels below the threshold of direct biological lethality at most distances. What remained, and what was now the dominant feature of the post-impact environment, was fire widespread, sustained, and still expanding across multiple continents and the atmosphere above it, which was being systematically loaded with the products of combustion on a scale that would determine the trajectory of life on Earth for months and years to come. The wildfires initiated by the thermal pulse of the first hours did not extinguish rapidly. In regions where the fuel load was sufficient and moisture conditions were unfavorable to natural suppression, fires continued to burn for days. Wind patterns, disrupted by the thermal gradients created by the impact and the fires themselves, drove combustion fronts through forested and semi-arid environments. The smoke and soot produced by these fires rose on convective columns driven by the heat of combustion, reaching altitudes of 10 to 15 kilometers, sufficient to inject fine particulate material into the lower stratosphere, where residence times are measured not in days, but in months to years. Material reaching stratospheric altitudes is above the weather systems that normally cleanse the atmosphere through precipitation. Once there, it circulates globally on stratospheric wind patterns, distributing itself across latitudes and forming a continuous layer capable of intercepting incoming solar radiation. The quantity of soot injected into the stratosphere during and immediately following the KPG fires has been estimated through multiple independent lines of evidence. Geochemical analysis of the boundary layer at sites around the world provides a direct measure of the carbon deposited globally. Current estimates range from approximately 15,000 to 35,000 million metric tons of soot entering the stratosphere in the days and weeks following the impact, a quantity sufficient, according to climate models, to reduce incoming solar radiation at the surface to a small fraction of its normal value for a period of months to potentially years. Against this developing atmospheric backdrop, the terrestrial ecosystems of the first days were experiencing conditions that varied significantly by geography, habitat type, and distance from the impact site. The pattern was not one of uniform destruction, but of highly differentiated stress, with some environments and some organisms facing immediate and lethal conditions, while others experienced disruption that was severe but not immediately fatal. In the river floodplain environments of late Cretaceous North America, where much of the best preserved dinosaur fossil record originates, the first days brought a combination of physical devastation and compounding environmental disruption. Fires had moved through forested areas. Tsunami-driven flooding had restructured low-lying coastal and river mouth environments. Ash, both from the wildfires and from fine particulate ejecta settling out of the atmosphere, was beginning to accumulate on surfaces, coating vegetation, fouling water sources, and altering the chemistry of soils and shallow water bodies. The effect of ash deposition on plant communities was immediate. Photosynthesis requires light. A layer of ash on leaf surfaces reduces the light available to the photosynthetic machinery of the plant, decreasing productivity even before the larger-scale reduction in solar radiation caused by stratospheric soot became fully operative. For herbivorous dinosaurs dependent on continuous access to fresh vegetation, the degradation of plant productivity in the first days represented the beginning of a food supply problem that would only intensify as the weeks progressed. The herbivore guild of the late Cretaceous was, in terms of body mass, among the most energetically demanding assemblages of animals in Earth's history. Triceratops, with a body mass of up to 12,000 kilograms, required the daily processing of hundreds of kilograms of plant material to sustain metabolic function. Edmontosaurus and related hadrosaurs, reaching masses of 3,000 to 4,000 kilograms, had proportionally similar requirements. These were not animals capable of surviving extended periods of food scarcity through physiological dormancy or metabolic depression. Unlike some small vertebrates, certain reptiles, amphibians, and mammals that can reduce metabolic rate dramatically during periods of resource limitation, large-bodied dinosaurs had no equivalent physiological mechanism available to them. Their survival was contingent on continuous access to sufficient plant biomass. The carnivorous dinosaurs of the first days faced a crisis connected in its underlying cause, but different in its immediate form. Large theropods are intermittent feeders. By necessity, the energetic cost of pursuing and subduing large prey means that individual predation events are spaced by intervals during which the predator subsists on stored energy. Reserves. A large tyrannosaurid could potentially survive for weeks between successful kills under normal conditions, drawing on fat reserves and reducing activity levels. In this respect, large carnivores had a short-term buffer that large herbivores lacked, but that buffer was finite, and it was being drawn down against a background of rapidly deteriorating prey availability. The prey animals that survived the first hours were now moving through a structurally disrupted environment. Fire had altered the distribution of vegetation cover. Ash was accumulating across the landscape. Water sources were being contaminated by ash, impact debris, and the chemical products of combustion, sulfuric and nitric acids forming in the atmosphere and descending in precipitation. The behavioral patterns of large herbivores, the movement routes, water sources, and feeding areas that defined their normal activity were no longer reliable. For predators that depended on the predictability of prey behavior, this disruption compounded the difficulty of securing food. The food chain collapse that would eventually drive the extinction of large dinosaurs did not begin with the disappearance of sunlight. It began in the first days, with the physical disruption of vegetation, the contamination of water, and the behavioral disorganization of prey communities. These were not immediately lethal processes for most large dinosaurs at distances sufficient from the impact site, but they initiated a cascade of resource depletion that would interact with the developing atmospheric crisis to produce conditions from which recovery was not possible. Smaller animals, the mammals, lizards, turtles, crocodilians, and small theropods that would ultimately survive the KPG boundary had physiological and behavioral characteristics that provided meaningful advantages in the conditions of the first days. Many were capable of consuming a wide range of food types. Mammals of the late Cretaceous were predominantly small, with body masses generally below 1 kilogram, and were largely insectivorous or omnivorous, capable of exploiting food sources including insects, seeds, fungi, and carrion that remained available even in severely disrupted environments. Their small body size meant low absolute food requirements. Their burrowing behavior provided shelter from the thermal effects of the first hours and from the ashfall of the first days. Insects, which represent the base of many small animal food chains, are notably resilient to physical disruption. Many species survive fire by occupying soil interstices, water bodies, or other protected microhabitats. Insect eggs and pupae, buried in soil or wood, can survive conditions lethal to adult organisms. In the post-impact world, Insects, along with fungi, exploiting the vast quantities of dead organic material accumulating on the surface, represented one of the few food resources likely to remain consistently accessible. The organisms capable of exploiting those resources had a survival advantage that compounded over the days and weeks ahead. The ocean environments of the first days were experiencing their own cascade of disruption. The sulfur dioxide and sulfur trioxide injected into the atmosphere by the vaporization of the Yucatan sulfate rock was dissolving into atmospheric moisture and descending as sulfuric acid precipitation with pH values, potentially reaching 1 to 2 inches, the most severely affected regions compared to a normal ocean surface pH of approximately 8.1. The acidification of surface ocean waters would have immediate consequences for organisms with calcium carbonate shells or skeletons, a category that included ammonites, many bivalves, foraminifera, and other marine invertebrates that form the base of marine food webs. The physiological stress imposed by rapid pH change is sufficient to reduce growth rates, impair reproduction, and increase mortality across affected populations without requiring complete dissolution of existing structures. The picture that emerges from the first days is of a world in which the conditions necessary for the continued function of complex, energy-intensive ecosystems were being systematically undermined. The fires were continuing, the ash was accumulating, the acid precipitation was beginning, the atmosphere above was being loaded with material that would, within days to weeks, produce the most consequential single effect of the entire impact sequence: the reduction of sunlight reaching the surface to levels incompatible with the productivity of the plant communities upon which the entire terrestrial food web depended. For the large dinosaurs still alive at the end of the first days, and there were many, distributed across the parts of the globe that had not experienced direct thermal lethality, the immediate physical crisis was giving way to a slower and more pervasive one. They had survived the fire. They had survived the blast. They had survived the seismic disruption. What they could not survive, and what was now in the process of becoming inevitable, was the darkness. By the end of the first week following the Chicxulub impact, the stratosphere above much of the planet carried a continuous and thickening layer of fine particulate material. Soot from the wildfires, sulfate aerosols derived from the vaporization of the Yucatan's gypsum-rich rock, and pulverized silicate dust from the impact, ejecta had been lofted into the upper atmosphere through a combination of explosive injection during the impact itself and convective transport on thermal columns rising from fires burning across multiple continents. These three categories of material behaved differently in the atmosphere and operated on different timescales, but their combined effect during the first weeks was the progressive attenuation of solar radiation, reaching the surface, a process climate modelers refer to as impact winter, and which represents, in current scientific consensus, the single most lethal environmental consequence of the Chicxulub event for terrestrial life. The physics of stratospheric aerosol forcing are well understood from multiple lines of evidence, including the documented climate effects of large volcanic eruptions. The 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo injected approximately 20 million metric tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, producing a measurable reduction in global mean surface temperature of approximately 0.5 degrees Celsius over the following 2 years. The Chicxulub impact injected sulfur compounds at an estimated volume between 100 and 500 billion metric tons, 4 to 5 orders of magnitude larger than Pinatubo. The climatic forcing associated with that sulfur load alone would have been sufficient to produce severe and prolonged surface cooling. The soot component, estimated at 15,000 to 35,000 million metric tons, added a dominant additional forcing mechanism. As black carbon particles are highly efficient absorbers of incoming solar radiation, the combined effect of these aerosol forcings during the first weeks was the onset of a global reduction in surface light levels that progressed from significant dimming to near total darkness across much of the planet within 1 to 2 weeks of the impact. Climate simulations, constrained by the geochemical evidence from the KPG boundary layer, have estimated that surface light levels fell to below 1% of normal values within the first weeks, a reduction sufficient to halt photosynthesis almost completely. In the Northern Hemisphere, where soot concentrations were highest due to the proximity of North American fires to the primary ejecta distribution, light levels may have approached zero for a period of weeks to months. Photosynthesis has a lower threshold, the light compensation point below which it cannot proceed at rates sufficient to sustain net primary productivity. That threshold varies by species, but generally falls between 1 and 2% of full sunlight for most vascular plants. Below it, a plant consumes more energy through respiration than it produces through photosynthesis, drawing down stored reserves until those reserves are exhausted. The light levels projected by impact winter models for the first weeks were, across broad regions, well below this compensation point. The consequences for terrestrial plant communities were not instantaneous, but were inevitable. Plants retained water and structural integrity initially, and those with underground storage organs, roots, rhizomes, and seeds retained chemical energy reserves that did not require light to maintain. But as the weeks progressed and photosynthesis remained suppressed, above-ground vegetation began to die. Leaves dropped. Growth ceased. The productive canopy that had covered the terrestrial surface of the late Cretaceous, the foundation of every terrestrial food chain, began to collapse from the top down. Different plant functional groups responded to light deprivation at different rates. Angiosperms, the dominant vascular plants of the late Cretaceous, included many lineages with dormancy strategies. The capacity to survive environmental stress as seeds, root systems, or underground storage organs, resuming growth when conditions improved. Ferns, with their long evolutionary history of colonizing disturbed environments, possessed spores capable of surviving in soil for extended periods and germinating rapidly when light returned. These characteristics conferred meaningful resilience against the conditions of impact winter. The fern spike, a globally documented pulse of fern spore abundance in sedimentary deposits immediately above the KPG boundary, identified at sites across North America, Europe, Asia, and the Southern Hemisphere, is one of the most informative signals in the post-impact plant record. In modern ecosystems, fern spikes are associated with recovery from disturbance events such as volcanic eruptions and fires, where ferns rapidly colonize bare substrate before other plant types re-establish. The KPG fern spike reflects this process operating at a global scale. The near elimination of the existing canopy, followed by the rapid re-establishment of fern communities as light returned, followed more slowly by angiosperm and conifer recovery over subsequent thousands to millions of years. For large herbivorous dinosaurs, the progressive failure of the plant canopy during the first weeks was a death sentence delivered in slow motion. The behavioral responses available to large herbivores facing food scarcity are limited. Increase foraging range, reduce non-essential activity to conserve energy, and consume lower quality food sources as preferred ones become unavailable. Each response had limits imposed by biology and by the scale of the disruption. Increasing foraging range requires moving through a landscape still characterized by fire damage, ash accumulation, and reduced vegetation cover. the energetic cost of locomotion in large animals is substantial. A triceratops or large hadrosaur expends significant caloric energy through movement alone, energy that must be recovered through feeding. In a landscape of diminishing food availability, the energetic return on expanded foraging diminishes rapidly, and moving farther may consume more energy than the food found can replace. Reducing activity levels to conserve energy is constrained by basal metabolic requirements. Even a resting large dinosaur required continuous minimum energy input to maintain body temperature, organ function, and cellular processes. Current evidence from bone histology, isotopic analysis, and comparative physiology supports the view that large non-avian dinosaurs had elevated metabolic rates relative to ectothermic reptiles, rates that imposed a continuous and non-negotiable energy demand regardless of activity level. There was no dormancy option. The energy had to come from somewhere, and as plant communities failed, that somewhere was running out. Carnivorous dinosaurs of the first weeks were in a position of short-term advantage. A landscape of dying and dead herbivores represented, briefly, an abundance of food in the form of carcasses. Scavenging behavior evidenced by tooth marks on herbivore bones in the fossil record would have become increasingly prevalent as the ratio of dead to living prey shifted. Large tyrannosaurids could sustain themselves on carrion for some period beyond the point at which active hunting became energetically unviable. But this advantage was temporary and self-limiting. The supply of carcasses was finite. As herbivore populations declined, the carrion resource declined with them, and carnivores faced the same ultimate constraint, a food chain collapsing from its base upward. Freshwater ecosystems offered a degree of buffering unavailable to terrestrial environments. Aquatic food chains include detritus-based pathways sustained by the decomposition of dead organic material that can persist for extended periods in the absence of active primary production. Organisms capable of exploiting detrital food sources had access to an energy pathway that remained functional even as surface light fell. This is consistent with the observed survival of freshwater turtles, crocodilians, and certain fish lineages across the KPG boundary animals whose diets and metabolic requirements were compatible with the reduced energy available through aquatic detrital pathways. The marine environment was experiencing the progressive failure of its own primary producers. Phytoplankton are subject to the same light compensation threshold as terrestrial plants. As stratospheric aerosols attenuated surface light during the first weeks, phytoplankton productivity fell across the illuminated surface ocean. The marine record documents a dramatic collapse in calcareous nanoplankton abundance above the KPG boundary microscopic photosynthetic organisms, whose calcium carbonate remains provide one of the most sensitive indicators of surface ocean productivity. Their abundance falls sharply above the boundary and remains low for hundreds of thousands of years, consistent with a prolonged collapse of marine primary productivity beginning in the first weeks following the impact. By the end of the first weeks, the world that late Cretaceous dinosaurs had inhabited a world of productive plant communities, abundant food, and stable environmental parameters had been replaced by something fundamentally different. The skies were opaque with aerosols. Surface temperatures were beginning to fall as the reduction in incoming solar radiation disrupted the atmospheric energy balance. The plants were dying. The food chains built upon them were fracturing. And the animals at the top of those chains, large-bodied, high metabolism, obligate consumers of abundant biomass, were entering a period of progressive and irreversible resource depletion from which, given the scale and duration of the disruption, there was no biological pathway to recovery. The Chicxulub impact did not kill the majority of Earth species through the force of its initial explosion. The blast radius of direct lethality, the zone in which the thermal pulse, overpressure, and seismic effects were sufficient to kill organisms outright, was large by any human measure, but it was geographically limited. Animals and plants existed across the entire planet, on land masses and in ocean systems separated from the Yucatan by thousands of kilometers. The mechanisms that drove the global extinction operated not through the physics of the impact itself, but through the cascade of environmental consequences that the impact set in motion, consequences that unfolded across multiple timescales and attacked the fundamental requirements of living organisms simultaneously and from multiple directions. The primary kill mechanisms can be organized into 3 overlapping phases, each operating across a different timescale and affecting different categories of organisms in different ways. The first phase, spanning the first hours to days, was thermal and mechanical. The re-entry pulse of superheated ejecta delivered an intense but brief period of radiant heating to the surface across much of the planet. Wildfires ignited across multiple continents. Tsunamis restructured coastal environments. Acid precipitation, generated by the atmospheric reaction of sulfur compounds with water vapor, began to fall. These mechanisms killed directly and rapidly, but their reach, while global in aggregate, was uneven in distribution. Organisms in thermally buffered environments, burrows, water bodies, dense moist forest, survived the first phase at rates significantly higher than those in exposed habitats. The first phase was severe, but it was not the primary driver of the mass extinction, it was the loading mechanism for what followed. The second phase, spanning weeks to years, was the suppression of photosynthesis. The stratospheric aerosol layer, composed of soot, sulfate particles, and silicate dust, reduced incoming solar radiation to levels below the photosynthetic compensation point across broad regions of the planet. Terrestrial plant communities collapsed progressively as stored energy reserves were exhausted and above-ground biomass died. Marine phytoplankton productivity fell sharply as light penetration through the ocean's surface layer was attenuated. The collapse of primary productivity at the base of both terrestrial and marine food webs initiated a cascading failure that propagated upward through every trophic level. Herbivores starved as plant biomass declined. Carnivores followed as prey populations collapsed. The energy that had sustained complex multi-trophic ecosystems for millions of years was no longer entering the system at rates sufficient to maintain them. The third phase, spanning years to tens of thousands of years, was climatic destabilization. The suppression of solar radiation produced global surface cooling estimated, in current models, at between 5 and 26 degrees Celsius below pre-impact mean temperatures, with the range reflecting uncertainty in aerosol loading estimates and atmospheric residence times. This cooling was not uniform. It was most severe in continental interiors and at higher latitudes, and somewhat moderated in coastal and equatorial regions by the thermal inertia of the ocean. But even at the lower end of cooling estimates, the temperature shift was sufficient to drive significant changes in precipitation patterns, atmospheric circulation, and the geographic distribution of viable habitat for organisms adapted to the stable, warm conditions of the late Cretaceous. For non-avian dinosaurs specifically, the intersection of these 3 phases with their particular biology produced an outcome that was, given the scale and duration of the disruption, very close to inevitable. Their vulnerability was not a product of evolutionary inadequacy. It was a product of the specific mismatch between their biological requirements and the conditions that the impact created. Large body size, which had been one of the defining advantages of the dominant dinosaur lineages, enabling access to food resources unavailable to smaller animals, reducing predation risk, and conferring thermal stability in a warm climate became a liability in the post-impact world. The allometric relationship between body mass and food requirements means that large animals need proportionally more food per unit time than small ones. In an environment where food availability was declining at rates driven by global photosynthetic failure, large animals reached starvation thresholds faster than small ones, had fewer alternative food sources available to them, and had no physiological mechanism for reducing their minimum energy requirements to match the diminished supply. The metabolic profile of large non-avian dinosaurs compounded this vulnerability. Evidence from bone microstructure, isotopic analysis of fossil tissues, and phylogenetic bracketing, the inference of physiological characteristics from comparisons with living relatives, indicates that large dinosaurs maintained elevated metabolic rates relative to ectothermic reptiles. This elevated metabolism was central to their ecological success under normal conditions, enabling rapid growth, sustained activity, and effective thermoregulation in a warm climate. Under post-impact conditions, it became a fatal constraint. An animal that cannot reduce its basal metabolic rate cannot reduce its minimum food requirement. A minimum food requirement that cannot be met leads with physiological certainty to death. Reproductive biology imposed additional constraints on recovery even for populations that might have survived initial starvation pressure. Large dinosaurs, based on evidence from nest site geology, egg structure, and growth rate data, had reproductive strategies characterized by relatively long incubation periods, extended juvenile growth phases, and, compared to small vertebrates, low reproductive rates. A population reduced to low numbers by starvation and environmental stress would have required stable conditions and abundant food to rebuild. Neither condition was available in the post-impact world on the timescales relevant to population recovery. Small mammals, by contrast, could reach reproductive maturity in weeks, produce multiple litters per year, and rebuild populations rapidly. From small founding groups, a reproductive profile ideally suited to exploiting the patchy and unpredictable resources of the post-impact landscape. The ocean extinctions followed a parallel but mechanistically distinct pathway. The collapse of phytoplankton productivity removed the foundation of marine food webs. Calcareous organisms, ammonites, many bivalve lineages, foraminifera faced the combined stress of food web collapse and ocean acidification driven by the dissolution of atmospheric sulfur and carbon dioxide into surface waters. The pH of surface ocean water fell rapidly in the weeks and months following the impact, reaching values that impaired or prevented the calcification processes by which these organisms built their shells and skeletons. For ammonites, a group that had been one of the most diverse and abundant marine invertebrate lineages of the Mesozoic, surviving multiple previous extinction events, the combination of acidification and food web disruption proved insurmountable. They disappear entirely from the fossil record at the KPG boundary. The selectivity of the KPG, extinction, the pattern of which organisms survived and which did not, is itself one of the most informative aspects of the event. Across both terrestrial and marine environments, survival correlated strongly with specific biological characteristics: small body size, dietary generalism, low metabolic rates, access to detrital or non-photosynthesis-dependent food pathways, and reproductive strategies capable of rapid population recovery. These characteristics were not randomly distributed across the tree of life. They clustered in specific lineages: the small mammals, the freshwater turtles, the crocodilians, the insects, the ferns that would form the biological foundation of the post-extinction world. The non-avian dinosaurs as a group possessed few of these characteristics. They were predominantly large-bodied. Their dietary specializations, the highly derived dentitions of hadrosaurs, the cropping beaks of ceratopsids, the predatory morphology of large theropods, were adaptations to food sources that were either directly eliminated or collaterally disrupted by the post-impact environment. Their metabolic rates precluded dormancy. Their reproductive rates precluded rapid population recovery. They were, in the language of ecology, K-selected organisms adapted to stable, resource-rich environments with low demographic turnover in a world that had abruptly and catastrophically become R-selected in its demands, rewarding rapid reproduction, dietary flexibility, and minimal resource requirements above all else. The asteroid, in this sense, did not simply kill the dinosaurs. It changed the rules. The biological characteristics that had made non-avian dinosaurs the dominant terrestrial vertebrates for 165 million years were precisely the characteristics that made survival in the post-impact world impossible. And the characteristics that had kept small, generalist, burrowing mammals at the ecological margins of the Mesozoic were precisely those that made survival not only possible, but probable. The question of how long non-avian dinosaurs survived after the Chicxulub impact is not purely academic. It bears on fundamental questions in paleontology and evolutionary biology: how quickly ecosystems collapse under catastrophic forcing, whether large-bodied megafauna can persist in severely disrupted environments, and what the relationship is between the physical mechanisms of an extinction event and the biological timeline of its consequences. The traditional view, what might be called the lower survival estimate, holds that non-avian dinosaurs were effectively eliminated within a geologically brief interval following the impact, measured in thousands of years at most, and possibly in centuries or less for many populations. This view is grounded primarily in the fossil record, and specifically in the resolution at which that record can be read across the KPG boundary. The most intensively studied section of the terminal Cretaceous dinosaur record is the Hell Creek Formation of the western interior of North America, which preserves sedimentary sequences spanning approximately the last 1.5 million years of the Cretaceous, with a resolution sufficient to distinguish stratigraphic intervals of tens of thousands of years. Within this formation, the pattern of dinosaur fossil occurrence relative to the KPG boundary identified by the iridium anomaly, shocked quartz, and other impact indicators has been examined in detail by multiple research groups over several decades. The consistent finding across these studies is that non-avian dinosaur remains do not occur above the KPG boundary in the Hell Creek Formation in any context that has withstood rigorous stratigraphic scrutiny. The uppermost confirmed dinosaur fossils in the formation occur within approximately 3 meters of sediment below the boundary layer. Given the estimated depositional rate of Hell Creek sediments, approximately 1 meter per 10,000 to 30,000 years, this 3-meter gap translates to a last appearance of dinosaurs somewhere between 30,000 and 90,000 years before the impact. This observation has been interpreted in 2 ways. The first, consistent with the Signor-Lipps effect discussed in an earlier analytical context, attributes the gap to incomplete preservation. The probability of fossilizing an individual organism in any given stratigraphic interval is low, and the apparent last appearance of a species in the fossil record systematically underestimates its true last occurrence. The second interpretation takes the gap more literally, suggesting that dinosaur populations in at least some regions may have been in decline or had already been reduced to low densities before the impact arrived. The lower survival estimate does not require the second interpretation. Even accepting that the 3-meter gap reflects incomplete sampling rather than genuine pre-impact decline, The absence of confirmed non-avian dinosaur fossils above the KPG boundary in Hell Creek and in virtually every other well-studied continental section worldwide constrains the duration of post-impact. Survival to an upper limit determined by the resolution of the stratigraphic record. If dinosaurs had persisted for hundreds of thousands of years after the impact, their remains should appear in post-boundary sediments with some regularity. Given the density of fossil collection effort in formations like Hell Creek, the absence of such finds is, under standard paleontological interpretation, evidence against prolonged survival. The physical mechanisms of extinction support a rapid timeline. The collapse of terrestrial primary productivity during the impact winter, as constrained by climate models and the plant fossil record, is estimated to have reduced above-ground plant biomass to levels insufficient to sustain large herbivore populations within weeks to months of the impact. Large herbivores facing starvation at the scale implied by global photosynthetic failure do not persist for extended periods. Physiological studies of starvation in large mammals, the closest available analogues for estimating survival times in large dinosaurs, indicate that animals of body masses between 1,000 and 10,000 kilograms can survive complete food deprivation for periods ranging from several weeks to a few months, depending on initial fat reserves and metabolic rate. Beyond that interval, without resumed food intake, death is physiologically certain. Projecting these parameters onto the late Cretaceous herbivore guild Triceratops at up to 12,000 kilograms, Edmontosaurus at 3,000 to 4,000 kilograms suggests that, under conditions of severely reduced food availability rather than complete deprivation, survival might have extended somewhat beyond the starvation threshold applicable to total food absence. Animals capable of consuming lower quality or less preferred food sources, bark, dead vegetation, material that would not normally constitute the diet of a specialized herbivore, might have extended survival by weeks or months beyond populations limited to their normal dietary preferences. But the key constraint is not the survival of individual animals. It is the survival of populations large enough to sustain reproduction and resist the demographic pressures of reduced juvenile survival, disrupted breeding behavior, and continued environmental stress. Population viability analysis, a framework used in conservation biology to estimate the minimum population size required for a species to have a meaningful probability of long-term persistence, indicates that large-bodied species with low reproductive rates require minimum viable populations, typically in the range of several hundred to several thousand individuals, with access to sufficient habitat and food resources to sustain reproduction across generations. The conditions of the post-impact world were inconsistent with the maintenance of minimum viable populations for large dinosaurs across any of the timescales implied by population viability thresholds. Food resources were insufficient. Habitat was severely disrupted. Juvenile survival, already a vulnerable phase in the life history of large dinosaurs, given the investment required in growth from hatchling to reproductive maturity, would have been disproportionately affected by the reduction in food availability. The lower survival estimate therefore converges on a timeline of extinction measured in centuries to a few thousand years for most non-avian dinosaur lineages, with some regional variation depending on the severity of local environmental disruption and the specific biological characteristics of individual species. Populations at higher latitudes, already adapted to seasonal variation in light availability and temperature, may have had marginally greater physiological tolerance for the reduced light conditions of impact winter. Populations in environments with access to persistent water sources and some residual plant productivity may have persisted somewhat longer than those in more severely disrupted landscapes. But these are differences of degree within a trajectory that, under the traditional view, led to the same endpoint on a timescale geologically indistinguishable from instantaneous. The traditional view does not claim that every non-avian dinosaur died on the day of the impact or even within the first year. It claims that the environmental consequences of the impact created conditions under which the survival of viable, reproducing populations of large non-avian dinosaurs was not biologically possible beyond a relatively brief post-impact interval. The precision of the fossil record is insufficient to resolve survival durations of centuries within a boundary that represents millions of years of geological time. What the record does show, consistently and across multiple continents, is that non-avian dinosaurs were present in abundance immediately below the KPG boundary and absent above it. The inference drawn from that pattern that extinction was geologically rapid remains under the lower survival estimate framework, the most parsimonious interpretation of the available evidence. This parsimony is not without challenge. The fossil record is incomplete by its nature, and incompleteness introduces uncertainty that cannot be fully resolved by stratigraphic analysis alone. The question of whether that incompleteness conceals a longer period of post-impact survival, whether some populations of non-avian dinosaurs persisted in refugia in isolated geographic regions or in ecological niches that provided temporary buffering against the worst effects of impact, winter is a legitimate scientific question. It is a question that the traditional view answers in the negative, but not with absolute certainty. The evidence against prolonged survival is strong. It is not, however, complete. The traditional interpretation of the KPG extinction places the disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs within a geologically brief interval following the Chicxulub impact, a timeline measured in centuries to a few thousand years at most. This view is well supported by the fossil record and by the physical logic of the extinction mechanisms. It is not, however, the only interpretation that the available evidence permits. A distinct body of scientific thought, drawing on considerations of geographic heterogeneity, ecological refugia, and the inherent incompleteness of the fossil record, allows for the possibility that some non-avian dinosaur populations survived for considerably longer, potentially tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years beyond the KPG boundary in specific regions, under specific conditions that provided partial buffering against the global environmental disruption. This longer survival hypothesis does not require abandoning the established understanding of what the Chicxulub impact did to the global environment. It does not propose that the impact winter failed to occur or that food web collapse was less severe than current models suggest. What it proposes, more modestly, is that the global environmental disruption was not spatially uniform, that the fossil record's coverage of the post-impact world is geographically limited and statistically incomplete, and that biological systems, particularly those involving large, mobile animals in heterogeneous landscapes, do not necessarily respond to environmental forcing in the simple, synchronous manner that uniform extinction models imply. The geographic heterogeneity of the post-impact environment is a critical starting point for this argument. The environmental consequences of the Chicxulub impact the thermal pulse, the wildfire distribution, the stratospheric aerosol loading, and the resulting suppression of surface light and temperature were not uniformly distributed across the planet's surface. The initial thermal effects were most severe in the hemisphere containing the impact site and diminished with distance. The wildfire distribution was shaped by local fuel loads and moisture conditions, producing a pattern in which some regions experienced extensive combustion, while others, particularly those with high ambient moisture, were largely spared direct fire damage. The stratospheric aerosol layer, while globally distributed within weeks of the impact, was not of uniform optical depth across all latitudes and longitudes, Modeling studies indicate that the northern hemisphere, proximal to the largest fire sources, experienced more severe initial light attenuation than some southern hemisphere regions. These gradients in environmental severity imply that different regions of the planet would have experienced different timelines of ecological disruption. In the most severely affected regions, the continental interior of North America, for example, where fire damage was extensive, soot loading was highest, and the pre-existing fauna was already experiencing the direct effects of proximity to the impact site ecosystem collapse, and the starvation of large herbivore populations may indeed have proceeded on the rapid timescale implied by the lower survival estimate. But in regions at greater distance from the impact site, with different vegetation types, higher ambient moisture, access to persistent water sources, and somewhat less severe aerosol forcing, the rate of ecosystem degradation may have been slower, creating windows of time during which small or isolated dinosaur populations could have persisted. The southern hemisphere presents the most plausible geographic setting for longer survival scenarios. The land masses of what are now South America, Africa, Madagascar, and the Indian subcontinent were, at the time of the impact, positioned at distances of 10,000 to 15,000 kilometers or more from the Chicxulub site. The direct thermal effects of the impact were substantially attenuated at these distances. The distribution of wildfire, while global in aggregate, was less extensive in the southern hemisphere than in North America, based on the soot record preserved in boundary layer sediments from different geographic regions. Crucially, the southern hemisphere landmasses supported distinct dinosaur faunas, titanosaur sauropods, abelisaurid theropods, and other lineages that had been evolving in partial geographic isolation for tens of millions of years, whose specific biological characteristics and ecological contexts differed from those of their North American counterparts. Titanosaur sauropods, in particular, present an interesting case in the context of longer survival scenarios. These animals were, by the late Cretaceous, the dominant large herbivores across much of the southern hemisphere. Their dentition simple, pencil-like teeth used for stripping rather than grinding vegetation, and their digestive systems, inferred from body plan and gut volume estimates, suggest dietary flexibility somewhat greater than the highly specialized dentitions of hadrosaurs or ceratopsids. The ability to process a wider range of plant material, including lower quality vegetation such as bark, stems, and coarser plant parts, may have extended their capacity to persist in a landscape of diminishing primary productivity beyond what would have been possible for more specialized herbivores. The ecological context of southern hemisphere environments in the post-impact period also differed in potentially meaningful ways from that of North America. The plant communities of South America and Africa in the late Cretaceous included a higher proportion of evergreen and semi-deciduous vegetation types relative to the more strongly seasonal forests of Laramidia. Plants adapted to seasonal variation in light and temperature may have had greater resilience to the light reduction of impact winter than those adapted to the more uniformly warm and productive conditions of lower latitude Cretaceous. Environments. Underground storage organs, which provide the primary mechanism for plant survival through extended periods of light deprivation, are more prevalent in vegetation communities subject to seasonal stress. To the extent that southern hemisphere plant communities had a higher baseline capacity for dormancy and rapid recovery, they would have provided a more sustained, if reduced, food base for surviving herbivores. The longer survival hypothesis also draws support from theoretical considerations about population dynamics in heterogeneous landscapes. Large animals with broad geographic ranges do not respond to environmental disruption as single, panmictic populations. They exist as networks of semi-isolated subpopulations connected by dispersal, with local population dynamics shaped by local environmental conditions. A global environmental disruption that is heterogeneous in its spatial distribution, more severe in some regions, less severe in others, will eliminate subpopulations in the most severely affected areas while allowing persistence in the least affected ones. The overall extinction of the species or lineage occurs when the last viable subpopulation falls below the minimum size required for reproductive persistence, a process that, in a heterogeneous landscape with some refugial areas, can take considerably longer than the simple starvation timeline applicable to a uniform environment. This reasoning does not require that refugial populations were large or ecologically dominant. It requires only that some areas existed where the combination of reduced but not eliminated food availability, tolerable temperature conditions, and sufficient population density allowed reproduction to continue across at least some breeding cycles following the impact. The offspring of such populations would themselves face the same deteriorating environment, and the trajectory would still be one of eventual extinction. But the timeline would be extended relative to the uniform collapse model, potentially by tens of thousands of years. The fossil record cannot currently confirm or definitively refute this scenario, for reasons that are as much practical as theoretical. The post-KPG boundary sedimentary record of the Southern Hemisphere is considerably less well sampled than that of Western North America. Large areas of South America, Africa, Madagascar, and Antarctica that were dinosaur-bearing in the late Cretaceous have not been prospected with the intensity or stratigraphic precision that would be necessary to detect rare, late-surviving dinosaur remains. The probability of preserving and subsequently discovering the bones of a small, isolated population of large animals in a geologically brief post-impact interval is low under any circumstances, and approaches negligible in regions where fossil collection has been limited. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the longer survival hypothesis is physically plausible, ecologically coherent, and not excluded by the current fossil record. It is not the most parsimonious interpretation of the available data. The simplest reading of the evidence remains consistent with geologically rapid global extinction. But parsimony in paleontology is constrained by the sampling limitations of the fossil record, and the absence of post-boundary dinosaur fossils from understudied regions is not equivalent to evidence of their absence. The distinction between those two statements, absence of evidence versus evidence of absence, is one that the longer survival debate has consistently turned upon, and one that additional fossil evidence from undersampled regions of the Southern Hemisphere may eventually help resolve. The hypothesis that some non-avian dinosaur populations persisted beyond the KPG boundary for longer than the traditional model allows is not sustained purely by theoretical argument. A small but persistent body of physical evidence, fossil finds, stratigraphic anomalies, and geochemical data has accumulated over several decades that complicates the clean narrative of geologically instantaneous extinction. This evidence is contested and in several cases has been reinterpreted or explained away by subsequent analysis. But its existence and the ongoing scientific debate surrounding it reflects the genuine difficulty of establishing precise extinction timelines from an inherently incomplete geological record. The most discussed category of physical evidence involves what are known as reworked fossils, dinosaur bones or teeth found in sedimentary deposits above the KPG boundary. In principle, a dinosaur fossil occurring above the iridium layer should represent an animal that lived after the impact. In practice, the interpretation is considerably more complicated. Sedimentary processes, erosion, fluvial transport, bioturbation, and redeposition can displace fossils from their original stratigraphic context, moving material from older layers into younger ones. A dinosaur bone eroded from a Cretaceous deposit and redeposited in a Paleogene sedimentary layer would appear in the stratigraphic record to post-date the impact, when in fact it predated it. Distinguishing genuine post-boundary survival from taphonomic reworking requires detailed analysis of the physical condition of the fossil, the geochemical signature of the surrounding matrix, and the sedimentological context of the deposit. The Hell Creek Formation and its equivalent, the overlying Tulloch Formation in Montana, have been the primary focus of this debate in North America. Several studies over the past 3 decades have reported dinosaur remains, isolated teeth, and bone fragments occurring within the lowermost Paleocene sediments of the Tulloch, above the iridium anomaly that marks the KPG boundary. The most frequently cited of these findings involves hadrosaur and ceratopsid teeth recovered from sedimentary layers interpreted by their collectors as post-boundary in age. If the stratigraphic assignment of these specimens is correct, they would imply survival of at least some large dinosaur lineages into the early Paleocene, potentially tens of thousands of years beyond the impact. These findings have not achieved broad acceptance in the paleontological community, primarily because of concerns about reworking. Teeth, which are among the most durable vertebrate remains and among the most likely to survive transport and redeposition, are particularly susceptible to stratigraphic displacement. The physical condition of the specimens recovered from Tulloch sediments, surface weathering patterns, abrasion, and the geochemical relationship between the fossil material and the surrounding sediment has been interpreted by some researchers as consistent with reworking from older Cretaceous deposits rather than in situ. Preservation. A 2011 study by Fassett and colleagues examining hadrosaur bones from the Ojo Alamo sandstone in New Mexico, a formation that has been interpreted by some workers as straddling or postdating the KPG boundary, used paleomagnetic dating and geochemical analysis to argue that the specimens were genuinely Paleocene in age, implying survival of hadrosaurs for up to 700,000 years after the impact. This conclusion was subsequently challenged by other researchers who argued that the paleomagnetic and geochemical data were consistent with reworking and did not require a post-impact survival interpretation. The Ojo Alamo debate illustrates the methodological challenges that define this area of research. The formation spans a stratigraphic interval that includes the KPG boundary, and the lateral continuity of individual sedimentary layers within it is difficult to establish with precision across the distances involved. Paleomagnetic dating, the use of the magnetic polarity record preserved in sedimentary rock to assign ages based on the known timeline of geomagnetic reversals, provides age constraints that are useful but not always unambiguous when applied to formations with complex depositional histories. The debate has not been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties, and the Ojo Alamo specimens remain a contested data point in the longer survival literature. Outside North America, the evidence bearing on post-boundary dinosaur survival is even more limited and more ambiguous. In India, dinosaur-bearing deposits of the Lametta Formation, which preserves titanosaur sauropod remains and nesting sites, have been dated using multiple methods to the latest Cretaceous, with some interpretations placing the uppermost fossiliferous layers very close to or at the KPG boundary. The relationship between the Lametta Formation and the overlying Deccan Trap basalt and the precise stratigraphic position of the KPG boundary within or adjacent to these deposits has been a subject of ongoing investigation. Some researchers have argued that certain Lametta dinosaur localities may post-date the boundary implying survival of Indian titanosaurs into the earliest Paleocene. Others have maintained that the dating uncertainties are insufficient to support this conclusion and that the available evidence is consistent with pre-boundary deposition. In China, hadrosaur-bearing deposits in the Nangshong Formation of Guangdong Province have similarly been the subject of debate regarding their relationship to the KPG boundary. Early studies of the formation suggested that dinosaur-bearing layers extended above the boundary, a finding that would imply post-impact survival of Asian hadrosaur populations. Subsequent stratigraphic and geochemical analysis has complicated this picture, with some researchers arguing that the apparent post-boundary dinosaur occurrences reflect phases, changes, and lateral stratigraphic variation rather than genuine temporal extension of the dinosaur-bearing interval above the impact horizon. The pattern across these case studies is consistent. Physical evidence that initially appears to support post-boundary dinosaur survival is subsequently subjected to alternative interpretation that attributes the apparent anomaly to taphonomic or stratigraphic processes rather than genuine biological persistence. This does not mean the longer survival hypothesis is wrong. It means that the physical evidence currently available is not of sufficient quality or unambiguity to compel its acceptance. The debate turns repeatedly on the same methodological tension. The fossil record is incomplete and subject to physical processes that can displace material through time, but the completeness of that record in any given region is itself poorly constrained, making it difficult to distinguish true absence from sampling failure. There is one category of evidence that does not involve the direct preservation of dinosaur remains, but that bears indirectly on the question of survival duration. Palynological records. The preserved record of fossil pollen and spores across the KPG boundary document the collapse and subsequent recovery of plant communities in considerable detail. The recovery of terrestrial plant diversity after the impact was a protracted process, with some studies estimating that species richness did not return to pre-impact levels for millions of years in the most severely affected regions. In regions where plant recovery was somewhat faster, certain lower latitude or southern hemisphere localities where moisture availability and the seed bank legacy of pre-impact vegetation facilitated more rapid recolonization. The resumption of primary productivity may have occurred on a timescale of thousands rather than tens of thousands of years. If plant recovery in some areas was relatively rapid, the window during which herbivore survival was physiologically impossible would have been correspondingly shorter, allowing for the theoretical persistence of small dinosaur populations that had survived the initial collapse phase on diminishing resources. This reasoning is indirect and depends on a chain of inferences from plant recovery rates to herbivore food availability to population viability, each of which introduces uncertainty. It does not constitute evidence of survival in the same sense as a physically documented post-boundary fossil, but it establishes that the environmental conditions necessary for at least marginal persistence of large herbivores may have returned, in some regions, on timescales shorter than a uniform global collapse model would suggest. The current state of the evidence on longer dinosaur survival can be summarized as follows. Direct physical evidence is limited, contested, and has not achieved consensus acceptance. Indirect evidence from environmental recovery records is consistent with, but does not confirm the possibility of extended survival in specific regions. And the sampling limitations of the fossil record in the most geographically plausible refugial areas, the southern hemisphere landmasses, are sufficient to preclude confident conclusions in either direction. The question remains genuinely open, constrained by the boundaries of what the physical record can currently resolve, and likely to remain so until substantially more fossil data from post-boundary Southern Hemisphere deposits becomes available. The preceding examination of the fossil evidence and the physical arguments for extended post-impact survival leads naturally to a question that occupies the boundary between established science and reasoned speculation. What would survival have actually looked like, in biological and ecological terms, for a non-avian dinosaur population persisting beyond the KPG boundary? This is not a question the fossil record can currently answer directly. It is, however, a question that can be approached through the application of established principles from ecology, evolutionary biology, and conservation science to the specific biological characteristics of late Cretaceous dinosaurs and the specific environmental conditions of the post-impact world. The first and most fundamental constraint on any survival scenario is body size. The extinction selectivity of the KPG event shows a strong and consistent bias against large body mass across both terrestrial and marine environments. Among terrestrial vertebrates, the survivors were overwhelmingly animals below approximately 25 kilograms, a threshold that corresponds, roughly, to the upper limit of body size at which access to thermally buffered microhabitats, dietary generalism, and low absolute food requirements converge to provide meaningful survival advantages. No terrestrial vertebrate above this approximate threshold is confirmed to have survived the KPG boundary, with the exception of the largest crocodilians, which survived through a combination of ectothermy, aquatic habitat, and the availability of detrital food pathways in freshwater environments. For non-avian dinosaurs, the overwhelming majority of species were large-bodied by this criterion. The megaherbivores, the hadrosaurs, ceratopsids, and titanosaur sauropods were among the most massive terrestrial animals in Earth's history, and their extinction under KPG conditions is consistent with the mechanistic arguments about food requirements and metabolic inflexibility outlined previously. Any survival scenario for these lineages requires postulating conditions that substantially mitigated the food availability crisis, conditions that, while theoretically possible in specific geographic settings, represent outliers within the global pattern of post-impact environmental disruption. The most biologically plausible survival candidates within the non-avian dinosaur lineage are the smaller-bodied theropods. By the late Cretaceous, the theropod clade encompassed an enormous range of body sizes, from the multi-ton tyrannosaurids at one extreme to small, bird-like forms at the other. Several late Cretaceous theropod lineages, including certain troodontids, dromaeosaurids, and oviraptorosaurs, included species with body masses in the range of 1 to 25 kilograms. These animals occupied ecological niches as small predators, omnivores, and opportunistic foragers, and their dietary flexibility, while not as broad as that of contemporary small mammals, was considerably greater than that of the large specialized herbivores. A small theropod of, say, 5 kilograms, occupying a semi-arid or seasonally variable environment in the Southern Hemisphere in the immediate post-impact period, would have faced severe but not necessarily insurmountable challenges. Its absolute food requirement, the daily caloric intake necessary to sustain metabolic function, would have been a small fraction of that required by a large hadrosaur. It could potentially have exploited food sources unavailable to large animals: insects, which remained available through the detrital pathway, small vertebrates, including the frogs, lizards, and small mammals that survived the boundary, carrion from the mass die-off of larger animals, eggs and seeds from plant species with dormancy-adapted reproductive strategies. None of these food sources would have been abundant. Together, they might have been sufficient to sustain a small population of opportunistic, small-bodied theropods through the worst phase of the impact winter. The behavioral characteristics of small theropods are relevant to this scenario. Fossil evidence, including preserved nesting sites, evidence of gregarious behavior in some species, and the biomechanical characteristics of locomotion suggests that small theropods were active, cognitively flexible animals capable of exploiting a range of environmental contexts. The forebrain to body mass ratio of troodontids in particular has been cited as among the highest of any non-avian dinosaur group, implying cognitive capacities that may have facilitated behavioral flexibility in novel environments. Whether this cognitive flexibility was sufficient to enable meaningful adaptation to the radically altered post-impact landscape is speculative, but it is not implausible. Reproductive biology is a critical variable in any survival scenario. Small theropods, based on evidence from nesting sites and egg morphology, had reproductive strategies intermediate between those of large dinosaurs and those of small mammals, laying clutches of eggs with incubation periods likely measured in weeks to a few months, and with juvenile growth rates faster than those of large dinosaurs but slower than those of modern birds. A small theropod population capable of completing at least one reproductive cycle per year, even under conditions of reduced food availability, would have a demographic resilience significantly greater than that of large dinosaurs with multi-year juvenile growth phases. The minimum viable population size for a species with this reproductive profile is lower than for a large, slow-reproducing megaherbivore, reducing the threshold below which extinction becomes demographically inevitable. Geographic isolation would have been a defining feature of any surviving dinosaur population. The global connectivity of dinosaur faunas, the ability of populations to exchange individuals across continental distances, was severely disrupted by the post-impact landscape of fire damage, altered vegetation, and disrupted migration routes. A population surviving in a refugial area would have been effectively isolated from other populations, subject to the genetic and demographic consequences of small population size, inbreeding depression, reduced genetic diversity, and vulnerability to local stochastic events such as disease, drought, or localized environmental deterioration. Conservation biology has documented extensively the fragility of small, isolated vertebrate populations under stress, and the probability of long-term persistence diminishes rapidly as population size falls below several hundred individuals. The island biogeography framework, developed to explain patterns of species richness and extinction on oceanic islands, but applicable more broadly to any isolated habitat patch, provides a useful lens for thinking about. Refugial dinosaur populations. An isolated population in a habitat patch of limited size and productivity faces an extinction probability that increases as patch size decreases and as the surrounding matrix of unsuitable habitat expands. In the post-impact world, the matrix of unsuitable habitat regions where food availability, temperature, or light levels were incompatible with large vertebrate survival was vast, and the potential refugial patches were small and scattered. Under these conditions, even populations that survived the initial phase of environmental disruption would have faced ongoing demographic pressure from the isolation and resource limitation of their refugial habitats. The duration of survival under these conditions is the most difficult parameter to constrain. A small, isolated population of omnivorous small theropods in a southern hemisphere refugium, with access to detrital food pathways and some residual primary productivity, might plausibly have persisted for thousands of years, long enough to be considered a genuine post-boundary survivor population rather than a remnant of the pre-impact fauna dying in the immediate aftermath. Whether such a population could have persisted for tens of thousands of years long enough to potentially leave a detectable trace in the fossil record is less certain, given the compounding effects of isolation, inbreeding, and the slow recovery of the food resources necessary to sustain even minimal population viability. What this scenario does not produce, and what is important to be clear about, is a lineage of non-avian dinosaurs that escaped extinction in any lasting sense. The trajectory of any surviving population, under the conditions described, is one of eventual termination. The question is not whether non-avian dinosaurs ultimately went extinct. They did, completely, with the single exception of the avian lineage that had already diverged from the broader theropod radiation during the Jurassic and that survived the KPG boundary as a distinct and subsequently successful clade. The question is whether the endpoint of that extinction was reached simultaneously across the planet in the immediate aftermath of the impact, or whether it was reached at different times in different places, with the last populations persisting in refugia for periods that, while geologically brief, were biologically significant. The honest answer, given the current state of evidence, is that both scenarios are consistent with what is known, and neither can be confirmed or excluded with the precision that would be necessary to settle the question definitively. What can be said is that survival, where it occurred, would have looked nothing like the thriving ecosystems of the late Cretaceous. It would have looked like the end of something small groups of animals in a diminished landscape persisting on the margins of a world that was being rebuilt around them by the organisms whose biological characteristics happened to fit the new conditions. The non-avian dinosaurs, in any survival scenario, were already ecologically displaced. Their extinction was not a question of if. It was a question of when and where and in what numbers the last of them finally disappeared. The concept of a last dinosaur, a single individual, or a final remnant population, representing the biological terminus of a lineage that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for 165 million years, is compelling as an image, but it is not a concept that science can currently resolve with precision. The fossil record does not preserve last individuals. It preserves samples statistically incomplete, geographically uneven, taphonomically biased samples of organisms that lived and died across vast spans of time. The last non-avian dinosaur that ever existed left no marker distinguishing it from the thousands of individuals that preceded it in the stratigraphic record. Its bones, if preserved at all, lie somewhere in sedimentary deposits that have not yet been found, or that no longer exist, or that exist but have not yet been examined with sufficient resolution to identify what they contain. What science can identify, within the limits imposed by the fossil record, is the stratigraphically youngest confirmed occurrence of non-avian dinosaur remains the specimen or specimens whose position in the geological record places them closest in time to the KPG boundary, or potentially within the earliest Paleocene. This is not the same as the last dinosaur, but it is the closest approximation that physical evidence currently permits. The identification of that approximation is itself a matter of ongoing scientific debate, shaped by the same stratigraphic and taphonomic uncertainties that define the longer survival literature examined in the preceding analysis. Within the Hell Creek Formation of the western interior of North America, the most intensively sampled terminal Cretaceous dinosaur deposit in the world, the stratigraphically youngest, confirmed non-avian dinosaur, specimens occur within the uppermost meter or two of Cretaceous age sediment, immediately below the iridium-rich boundary clay. The species represented in these uppermost deposits include Triceratops, Horridus, and Edmontosaurus, Anectons, the two most common large dinosaurs of the Hell Creek ecosystem, along with less abundant taxa, including the Tyrannosaurid, Tyrannosaurus, Rex, and various smaller theropods, ornithomimosaurs, and pachycephalosaurs. The fact that these are the same species found throughout the Hell Creek sequence rather than a reduced or impoverished fauna indicative of pre-impact decline reinforces the interpretation that the Hell Creek dinosaur community was ecologically intact until very close to the boundary. Among individual specimens, one has attracted particular scientific attention in the context of the last dinosaur question. A Triceratops specimen recovered from sediments in the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, reported in a 2011 study by Lyson and colleagues published in the journal Biology Letters, was found with its uppermost horn core positioned within approximately 13 centimeters of the KPG boundary layer. The authors argued that this stratigraphic proximity, combined with the absence of evidence for reworking or post-depositional displacement, was consistent with the animal having lived very close to the time of the impact, potentially within a few thousand years of it, given the estimated depositional rate of the enclosing sediment. This specimen was informally described as the last Triceratops, though the authors were careful to note that this designation reflects stratigraphic position rather than any biological certainty about the animal's temporal relationship to the actual last surviving member of its species. The significance of this specimen extends beyond its stratigraphic position. It contributes to the broader argument, supported by multiple lines of evidence from the Hell Creek Formation, that the 3-meter gap between the last confirmed dinosaur fossils and the KPG boundary, which earlier analyses had interpreted as evidence of pre-impact decline, is an artifact of sampling rather than a FAIF, genuine biological signal. If individual specimens can be found within centimeters of the boundary rather than meters below it, the apparent gap narrows and the inference of a long pre-impact decline becomes less tenable. The closer the confirmed last occurrences are to the boundary, the more consistent the record is with abrupt, impact-driven extinction rather than gradual pre-impact attrition. Outside the Hell Creek Formation, the question of the stratigraphically youngest non-avian dinosaur is complicated by the dating uncertainties and stratigraphic debates surrounding the formations discussed in the context of longer survival. The Ojo Alamo sandstone specimens, if their post-boundary stratigraphic assignment is accepted, would represent younger occurrences than any confirmed Hell Creek specimen. The Nangseong Formation hadrosaurs and the Lametta Formation titanosaurs, under the most aggressive dating interpretations, have also been proposed as candidates for post-boundary survival. None of these claims has achieved the level of stratigraphic certainty that would place them beyond reasonable scientific dispute, and the Hell Creek specimens therefore remain, by default, the closest confirmed approximation to the last non-avian dinosaurs in the most rigorously documented part of the record. The question of which species was last is, at the current state of knowledge, unanswerable with confidence. The two most abundant large dinosaurs of the Hell Creek Triceratops and Edmontosaurus are the most likely candidates simply because their abundance in the pre-boundary record implies larger initial populations, which in turn implies a greater probability of stratigraphic survival close to the boundary and, potentially, of biological survival somewhat beyond it. A species represented by thousands of individuals across a broad geographic range at the time of the impact has more demographic inertia than a rare or geographically restricted one. If any North American dinosaur lineage persisted into the earliest Paleocene, the demographic logic favors the most abundant taxa rather than the rarest ones. In the southern hemisphere, where the longer survival hypothesis finds its most plausible geographic setting, titanosaur sauropods represent the most likely candidates for extended persistence. Their wide geographic distribution across multiple southern hemisphere landmasses, their dietary flexibility relative to more specialized northern hemisphere herbivores, and the somewhat less severe initial environmental disruption in the southern continental regions all contribute to a scenario in which isolated titanosaur populations may have persisted beyond the boundary for longer than their North American counterparts. The absence of well-dated post-boundary dinosaur deposits from the relevant southern hemisphere formations means that this scenario cannot be confirmed, but it also cannot be dismissed on the basis of negative evidence from an inadequately sampled record. There is a broader scientific and philosophical dimension to the question of the last dinosaur that is worth acknowledging directly. The designation of any particular specimen as the last of its kind is a retrospective act, possible only because we know the outcome that non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. The animal itself, living in whatever diminished and disrupted environment it occupied in the post-impact world, carried no knowledge of its status. It was an organism attempting to satisfy the same biological imperatives, obtaining food, avoiding predation, reproducing, that had governed the behavior of its ancestors for 165 million years. The environment in which it attempted those things was no longer compatible with success. That incompatibility, accumulated across generations and populations, is what extinction means at the biological level. The last non-avian dinosaur, whenever and wherever it lived, was not a monument or a symbol. It was an animal, likely stressed, likely operating in a severely impoverished landscape, likely the survivor of repeated population bottlenecks whose death differed from the deaths of its predecessors only in the fact that no offspring survived to continue the lineage. Science may never identify that individual with certainty. What it can do, and what the accumulated evidence from Hell Creek and the surrounding debate about longer survival does do, is narrow the range of times and places within which that final moment is likely to have occurred, and illuminate the biological and environmental conditions under which the last representatives of one of Earth's most successful vertebrate radiations finally and irreversibly disappeared. The extinction of non-avian dinosaurs and the collapse of late Cretaceous ecosystems did not produce a static or permanently impoverished world. The planet that emerged from the KPG boundary was not empty, it was severely depleted, but it retained the biological raw material from which new ecosystems would eventually be constructed. The organisms that survived the boundary did so carrying the genetic diversity, ecological plasticity, and reproductive capacity that would, over millions of years, generate the complex biosphere of the Cenozoic era. Understanding the recovery of life after the KPG event requires examining both the timescale over which that recovery occurred and the specific biological and ecological processes through which surviving lineages diversified to fill the ecological space vacated by the extinct. The immediate post-impact world, the first tens of thousands of years following the KPG boundary, was characterized by what ecologists describe as a survival phase, a period in which the dominant biological process was not diversification or ecological expansion, but simply persistence. The organisms present in this interval were those whose pre-existing biological characteristics had allowed them to survive the impact winter and its aftermath. They existed in a world of reduced species richness, simplified food webs, and patchy, recovering primary productivity. The ecological communities of the earliest Paleocene were not functional analogues of the late Cretaceous ecosystems they replaced. They were impoverished assemblages of generalist survivors exploiting whatever resources the recovering environment made available. The plant record captures this early recovery phase with particular clarity. The fern spike that characterizes the immediate post-boundary interval, the pulse of fern spore abundance, reflecting the rapid colonization of bare and disturbed substrate by fern communities, gave way, over thousands to tens of thousands of years, to the gradual re-establishment of more diverse plant communities. Angiosperms, which had survived the impact winter primarily through the dormancy of seeds and underground storage organs, were among the earliest recolonizers of recovering terrestrial surfaces. The angiosperm-dominated plant communities that re-established in the earliest Paleocene were initially of low diversity, dominated by a small number of opportunistic, fast-growing species capable of exploiting the disturbed, ash-enriched soils of the post-impact landscape. Over subsequent hundreds of thousands to millions of years, angiosperm diversity increased progressively as new species evolved and as plant communities developed the structural complexity, multiple canopy layers, diverse understory communities, complex root networks characteristic of mature forest ecosystems. The recovery of animal communities tracked the recovery of plant communities with a lag, reflecting the dependence of animal diversity on the food resources that plants provide. In the terrestrial realm, the mammals that had survived the KPG boundary as small, generalist, insectivorous and omnivorous forms began to diversify within the first million years of the Paleocene with a rapidity that has few analogues in the prior history of the group. The release from ecological competition with the dominant non-avian dinosaur fauna, which had occupied the large-bodied herbivore and carnivore niches for 165 million years, created an ecological landscape in which mammalian lineages could evolve into body sizes and ecological roles previously unavailable to them. The earliest post-boundary mammals were not dramatically different in body size from their Cretaceous predecessors. The first Paleocene mammal faunas, documented from deposits in North America, Europe, and Asia, consisted predominantly of small animals, condylarths, archaic ungulates, and other early placental lineages with body masses generally below 10 kilograms. But the trajectory of body size evolution within the mammalian radiation accelerated rapidly. Within approximately 10 million years of the KPG boundary, mammalian lineages had evolved body masses spanning several orders of magnitude, from small insectivores and rodent-like forms at one end to early large herbivores and carnivores approaching or exceeding 100 kilograms at the other. By the Eocene, approximately 56 to 34 million years ago, mammals had diversified into the full range of ecological roles that non-avian dinosaurs had previously occupied: large browsing herbivores, cursorial grazers, apex predators, aquatic forms, gliding arboreal species, and eventually, in the lineages leading to bats, fully volant insectivores and frugivores. This diversification was not simply a filling of pre-existing ecological templates. It was a creative process in which new body plans, new physiological strategies, and new ecological relationships evolved in response to the specific environmental conditions of the Cenozoic world. The Cenozoic was, in important respects, a different world from the Cretaceous cooler on average, with more pronounced latitudinal temperature gradients, expanding grassland biomes as global temperatures declined through the Eocene and Oligocene, and a different configuration of continents that shaped the geographic distribution and diversification of lineages. The mammals that filled the ecological space vacated by non-avian dinosaurs were not simply dinosaur replacements. They were a distinct radiation shaped by distinct evolutionary pressures that happened to converge on some of the same ecological roles while diverging substantially in others. The avian dinosaurs, the birds, represent a continuity rather than a replacement in this story. Birds had been present as a distinct lineage since the Jurassic, and by the late Cretaceous had diversified into multiple ecological roles, including fish-eating, seed-eating, and possibly omnivory. Several bird lineages survived the KPG boundary, and the post-impact world saw a rapid diversification of the avian radiation that mirrored, in some respects, the mammalian expansion. Modern bird orders, including the ancestors of passerines, raptors, waterfowl, and shorebirds, began to diversify in the earliest Paleocene and Eocene. The ecological roles occupied by birds in Cenozoic ecosystems, aerial insectivores, frugivores, granivores, piscivores, large cursorial herbivores represented in some cases genuine ecological novelty, and in others a continuation of roles that avian dinosaurs had occupied in the Cretaceous. The marine recovery followed a parallel but somewhat distinct trajectory. The collapse of marine primary productivity in the immediate post-impact period, driven by the suppression of phytoplankton productivity during the impact winter, was followed by a gradual recovery of marine food webs as stratospheric aerosols settled and surface light levels returned to values capable of sustaining net photosynthesis. The recovery of marine plankton communities is documented in the deep-sea sedimentary record as a progressive increase in the abundance and diversity of calcareous nanofossils and foraminifera above the KPG boundary, a process that took approximately 1 to 2 million years to approach pre-impact diversity levels in the most favorable environments. The extinction of ammonites, mosasaurs, and plesiosaurs created ecological space in the marine realm that was subsequently occupied by the diversification of bony fish lineages, the radiation of modern shark groups, and eventually, beginning in the Eocene, the return of large mammals to the marine environment in the form of the early cetaceans. The tempo of recovery was not uniform across environments or taxonomic groups. Some lineages diversified rapidly, reaching high species richness within a few million years of the boundary. Others recovered slowly, constrained by the pace of environmental recovery, the availability of suitable habitat, or the inherent rate of morphological evolution in lineages with long generation times. The global recovery of terrestrial plant diversity to something approaching pre-impact levels is estimated to have required approximately 9 to 10 million years. The recovery of large-bodied terrestrial vertebrate diversity, measured by the re-establishment of complex, multi-trophic communities with large herbivores, large carnivores, and diverse mid-sized fauna, took a similar or somewhat longer interval. 10 million years is, by any human measure, an incomprehensibly long time. It is longer than the entire span of recognizable hominin evolution. It represents the duration of the biological debt imposed by a single impact event, the time required for evolutionary processes, operating continuously across surviving lineages, to rebuild the ecological complexity that had accumulated over the preceding hundreds of millions of years of Mesozoic life. The KPG extinction did not simply remove the non-avian dinosaurs, it reset the trajectory of complex life on land, redirecting the evolutionary future of the planet along pathways that would not have been accessible had the impact not occurred. The mammals that inherited the Cenozoic world, and among them, eventually, the primates, and among the primates, the hominins were the beneficiaries of that redirection. The evolutionary opportunity that produced the mammalian radiation, and ultimately the lineage leading to our own species, was created by the removal of the ecological constraints that non-avian dinosaur dominance had imposed on mammalian diversification for 165 million years. The asteroid that struck the Yucatan 66 million years ago did not merely end the age of dinosaurs. In doing so, it initiated the sequence of events that would eventually produce the only species in Earth's history capable of reconstructing, from the physical evidence left in ancient rock, the story of what happened and why?